Well, how did it go? We decided, okay, we're going to talk about MTG. Like, what do you need to know to start playing an MTG?
Anyone here who's old enough to remember that there was an era of our life when the internet was still coming up, and there was a book series out there of Blank for Dummies.
Oh,
right?
yes.
So like I at one point bought a Excel for Dummies book, and I never read it.
I have Chess for Dummies around here somewhere. So,
but the idea, I guess, of this topic is, what did we learn later? What about the game is something that isn't necessarily normal set of rules, things that like, oh, I didn't know that, or anything people should know, right? I did pose the question to Reddit earlier today about like, what are some hard lessons you learned or things you learned later in the game that you wish you knew earlier? And there's some pretty common themes in there, and some of them I'm like, okay, I feel like a victim here. Stop talking about me.
Yeah, that got some really good traction. I'm looking at it now, and I'm seeing 283 comments, which is pretty good. A lot of them were very much like, yep. Like the number, the highest rated one, I think, is one of the hardest ones to really wrap your head around if you're not an extremely logical person. Like, like a good example is, I know I have some friends, and my wife are very math oriented. And so this never really affected them. But for me, yes, this 5+ mana card will be so good when I get those other 3 5+ mana cards on the board. And that is so accurate. It is extremely accurate to how I used to build decks back in the day. I would create these synergies that required, 15, 16, 17 mana to get online, and even more, and it would never happen because it would just get dismantled before it even got off the ground. And what's funny is Commander is almost in some ways the antithesis of this, because Commander, a lot of times you do have a combo that requires 15, 16 mana to get online. But in Commander, it doesn't matter as much because there are so many more targets on the board that if somebody sees you building something, a lot of the times they'll think, okay, I can handle that later. And that alone gives you the chance to make it and to be able to be like, oh, okay, then I can build it. But in other formats, and in extreme cases in Commander, it's just not viable.
Right, definitely. And it's we run into the problem too, and like my reply to this person who made that is like, especially when your opening hand has all 4 of those pieces, you're like, I'll just wait it out.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
exactly.
Okay, what are you gonna do all game other than just die before you get to play any of that?
Yeah, exactly. I've experienced that so many times where I draw and I have all my combo pieces in my hand. I'm like, yes. And then I start playing the game and I get into turn 2 and I start, the math starts hitting me and I start going, oh, wait, I'm not going to be able to cast this until turn 4. And then this, I can't cast until turn 5. But then that means I can't use the activated ability of the first one because that's 4 mana. You know what I mean? Like it just snowballs out of control, and you're just like, oh God, what did I do?
The other big piece, and this is something that came up a lot in those comments as well, is you have to run more protection and interaction. Because if you're just playing solitaire trying to get your combo out, guess what? Someone's going to notice and someone's going to remove it, and you didn't have any protection in your hand.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing with the game, is like lower mana curve, right? And that's a big piece people struggle with because they want to put the big stompy creatures in and the big spells, right? Like a lot of people were hating on Doubling Season, saying it's like not actually a great card, and it's like, yes and no. But like it takes up a slot and it has a job, but like it doesn't do anything unless you're doing something else, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't protect you. It doesn't create value on its own. It is a piece that's like getting your French fries on the side of your meal. But like it's not substance.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just gonna say that the other big piece with that is like you play your commander or you play your combo piece, and unless you have like haste or a bunch of mana, you're gonna have to wait a whole turn cycle.
Yep.
And it's going to get removed if anyone has anything worth anything. If you're playing against lower power levels or people who just don't play removal, you'll probably be fine. But they're gonna start complaining that you get your combo out all the time. It's like, okay, well, or interaction, and then we also run down that slippery slope where how much of your deck is actually deck versus just interaction pieces and board wipes and all these things you have to put in because that's the meta.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one thing in fact, I misunderstood the one, and this shows you that I'm not great at reading comprehension, which makes me great at Magic. But
hey, that's a whole nother thing in there too, is about reading the cards.
Reading the cards, yes. But
the other big thing there, and this is a part where, again, I had to like think about this, and it's your play style, right? And it's one of those things I'm still working on. Like I see, like I mentioned even in the post itself, like learning, okay, well, I don't have to play this main phase 1, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Or
yeah.
I don't have to play my instant at sorcery speed. Like if it doesn't have an immediate effect, it can wait and give me options if I have something else I maybe want to do. But the big thing there is, okay, so I'm saving my interaction for something that actually affects my game plan.
Yeah.
Not, they played a big scary thing. Well, it doesn't hurt me right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of examples in there too where people were talking about maybe don't remove that stacks piece because it might be affecting someone worse than you.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like sometimes that's part of the politicking of the game is, is trying to assess in those scenarios, like, okay, is this something that I need to worry about? Or maybe it is, but you're pretty sure the person across the table from you has removal as well, and it hurts them worse. So let's see what they do. And that also comes into another thing. Pay attention. Like, get off your damn phone. Play the game. Like that's, it's easy to fall off of that. But yeah.
It does get difficult when someone's taken a 20-minute plus turn.
Yeah.
And it's like I don't even know what you did. Like 5 minutes ago because you've been sitting here for so long.
Yeah.
Like, it is a struggle, but it's that whole thing of like try not to have a sidebar conversation, pay attention to what's going on. That way when your turn comes, right, you know what your game plan is. You draw a card and then that might change your game plan, but otherwise you should be like 90% sure what you're doing.
Yeah. I was so guilty of that on Saturday night. I was having a sidebar conversation. This guy walked up and was talking to us and I got sucked into the conversation, and it was, so there was a couple of times where they were like, Nate, it's your turn. And I was like, oh crap. I'm sorry guys. What do I need to do? But
that is the epitome of kitchen table magic.
Oh yeah. It's that's a hard thing about kitchen table magic is a lot of times, especially now that as you get older, sitting down and playing with these folks, like a lot of times it's the first time you've seen them in like 3-4 months. So you spend, you want to spend the time catching up, but at the same time, you want to get as many games in as you possibly can. And so it becomes this battle.
It's the same reason why we don't record and play at the same time.
Exactly. But one I wanted to point out was, and this one is one I learned when I started getting into draft and learning stuff about how to assess cards in draft. And it was one from this Quantex 609. Some cards are very flashy, but if they're only effective when I'm already in the lead, then they aren't that helpful and should probably be cut. And that is something, if you figure out how to do this, and I'm not saying I have, but if you figure out how to assess a card in how it does in 3 scenarios, and those scenarios are when you're ahead, when you're neck and neck with your opponent, and when you're behind. If you can figure out, okay, does this card help me in all 3 of these scenarios, and only 2 of the scenarios, or only 1 of the scenarios, your card assessment will go through the roof. Because just like he says, if the card only helps you when you're ahead, then it's not that great. It's, it's going to help you in very specific corner cases when you're already doing well and probably are already going to win the game. Right. But if it helps you when you're neck and neck or when you're behind, those are much more valuable because then they can change the tide of the game. And that's very important. Now, if they're good in all 3, then hey, that's money. But yeah, that is something that if you need to work on anything with cards and building decks and draft, it's figure that out and then contact me and tell you how you did it so I can learn.
To be fair, I think a few months ago I saw that like the Nitpicking Nerds did a video on that exact like philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, even it's like, oh, okay, I mean that makes sense, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you have to evaluate the card and say, okay, well, what kind of game state does this actually get played?
Yeah.
Because like if I'm behind, do I have the mana to play this? Or if I'm in the far of the lead, do I care about this thing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's playing a Llanowar Elves turn 8.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's an early game card. It's still good for ramp if that's what you're aiming for and you're in green, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a late game card. It doesn't have impact even middle game, arguably.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like it can, yes, it can ramp you a extra mana up after you invest in it.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very minimal
Mm-hmm.
middle game, right? But it's still that same idea of like you want it to be affecting more than one phase of the game.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a, that is a great lesson to learn if you can, is how to assess cards in particular situations, because that will help you understand whether a card is good or not. And even then it's hard. Like even then some of the best, like you will see a good example. I mentioned it last week or last time. There was a card, it was a removal card from Wilds of Eldraine called Toss a Coin. And it was early on in the draft assessments was like, it's okay, because it was only it was a pinger. It just did 1 damage. But then as people started paying attention to the format and noticing, wait, that card's a 1/1, that card's a 2/1, that card's a 3/1. Like, oh my God, this is straight removal for a lot of creatures, a lot of powerful creatures in this format, at least for limited. But it's that kind of thing. Even people who know how to do this very well make mistakes on this because that's how hard it is.
Maybe that, and like how many times have you seen a card and you're like, oh my God, that's great. And then you play it, you're like, this doesn't do what I thought it did.
Exactly.
And that's beyond the not reading it, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. When you get into the scenario, and this kind of plays back a little bit into what we were saying about the 5+ mana cards and everything. I'll use the example of Outlast, the mechanic Outlast. Now, I recognize that most people who are very good at assessing mechanics saw Outlast and was like, wow, that's mid at best. And Outlast was a mechanic from Khans of Tarkir, and it usually was Outlast and a cost. So there's, for example, Abzan Falconer, it's 2 and a white creature, human soldier, it's 2/3 power toughness, and it has Outlast 1 white. Basically you pay a white, then you tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, Outlast only as a sorcery. The paying the white, the tapping it, and putting the counter on it, not so bad. That's not very bad. Tapping it, it's a little it would be busted if you could do it without tapping it. But then the added sentence of Outlast only as a sorcery kills this mechanic, because essentially you have to waste an entire turn to get 1 +1/+1 counter on it. And yes, it does have the ability, each creature you control with +1/+1 counters has flying. So basically, if you have any creatures you have +1/+1, it has flying. That's pretty good. But I know the first couple times I saw this card in the random chaos drafts I've been in, and I see it and I see Outlast and I read it and I miss that sentence, Outlast only as a sorcery, and I go, oh, this is great. I'm jamming this into my Abzan, whatever. And then I actually get into the game and I go, oh,
yeah.
Because, when you first see it, you're getting visions of, oh, I'm just going to tap this at the end of my opponent's turn and put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then I'll be able to swing in and then do it again and then do it again. And I'm going to have this beefy
and
flying
actually
creature.
Have a blocker.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And I'm going to have this massive creature that will just mow them down. No, I have a 2/3 that maybe becomes a 3/4 before it gets blasted off the board or chump block something. So that way I don't die on the 3rd turn of the draft.
Well, what's funny about that card you're talking about is it's better for its other ability once you take an effect of the Neon Dynasty and cards like that, where they started getting really into the modified.
Yep.
Kind of tossing +1/+1 counters out like they're freaking candy on Halloween.
Yep.
Because you don't want to get it on there via Outlast. You want it on there via everything else, and then just utilize the other ability where now they all have flying.
Exactly. It's not a bad card. In draft, it's a bad card. In the right deck, it's a great card. But that's actually an excellent example of the card assessment, that if you have it, it will serve you very well, is to catch it. Now, granted, my card assessment on this is just because I didn't read the whole damn thing like I should have. But I missed a whole sentence that is kind of bad. Those words are important. They don't put them on there just for funsies. Well, the flavor text they do, but everything else is usually there for a reason, and you should read it. And that's the other thing, is read the cards. And this actually, to tie into that, ask questions. If you don't know how a mechanic works, if you don't know how an interaction works, and especially if you're at an LGS, call a judge. And your opponent's not going to, let your opponent know, yeah, I'm asking what this, because I don't understand this. And even if your opponent is explaining it to you, still a good idea to ask a judge so that get a,
well, especially when it's not your deck and not your cards, right?
Yeah.
Where they start using the cards that are in Phyrexian or whatever, and you can't actually read it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's difficult.
Ask questions. I mean, look things up, and even then, I personally, if I'm playing with a card that's not in English, I do try to have a saved picture of it on my phone for reference, just so I can say, okay, this is what this says, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that kind of leads into one of the other topics. A bit of what came up is understanding what you're trying to get out of the game. That's a big thing we've talked about previously too, where what does fun mean to you, and understand that, because some people go into this, and like you mentioned, people show up to competitive events and go, oh, I don't like this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you show up at a casual EDH table and it's too slow and you're just sitting there pub stomping people, and it's okay, well, maybe that's not fun for everybody. And granted, there's people who, both sides of that argument, where it's my enjoyment of the game shouldn't be dependent on anyone else's enjoyment. And while that's true, that's pretty selfish.
Yeah.
And you want to have that social aspect of the game, because if all you care about is winning, play competitive. Go play Modern or Pioneer or just normal competitive Magic. Go to Draft Night, where it's cutthroat. It's I'm here to win. That's it. I'm not here to chit chat and have fun and play weird cards and combo off of stuff, or as I've done before, enchant someone's creature with Eldrazi Conscription as long as they don't attack me, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Little politics and stuff like that. It's you could do that. You can have fun, and that, and I'll draw a card, and it's not a good play, but I'll play it because it's fun.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's kind of and this actually leads me to another story from draft on Friday that happened. So turn one, I get a special guest Tragic Slip, and I'm like, wow, this is great. Turn two, I get a Death Cloud, which, if from the list, it was a list card. Now, Death Cloud is 3 and 3 black, or no, I'm sorry, X and 3 black, and basically it's you discard X cards, every player discards X cards, loses X life, sacrifices X creatures, sacrifices X lands. Okay. It's a bananas card. It's kind of crazy. And to have it in draft was kind of silly. But I drafted it because I was like, all right, and also it's a couple bucks. So I was like, all right, that's fine. I'm already in black with a Tragic Slip. Let's do it. And then I just kept getting removal card after removal card. And I was like, all right, I guess I'm running black. Then I found out later I was essentially mono black. And then I found out later that black is the weakest color in Murders of Karlov Banner, but we won't talk about that. But I got to cast Death Cloud twice in 2 rounds. And in one case, it might have helped me if things had gone slightly differently. It might have won me the game. It didn't. But the second time, at that point, I was losing, and I was like, all right, let's just play this for shits and giggles. And it was fun. It was just fun. It was fun to play. And it didn't mess up my opponent either. That was the other thing. I realized draft a little bit more competitive, but I wasn't being mean with it or anything. Of course,
let us know in the comments, what other experiences you guys have, things you've learned later in the game. I mentioned as well previously that, learning later that, oh, hey, I have to tap their creature before they declare their attacker, right? Stuff like that where you're just taught wrong too.
Yeah.
depending on how long ago you started learning, and the internet for Magic wasn't really much there to begin with.
Mhm. Yep.
And everything you learned was from your buddies.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and you know, and that, and I know this is probably one of the ones you're referencing. The sequencing,
Mhm.
the you know, maybe, you know, the way you're supposed to do it, you know, untap, upkeep, draw, you know, that kind of thing, like at the beginning of the game. Some people learn that, like, oh, okay, I'll just lay my land and then I'll untap and everything. Like, I'll lay my land while I'm untapping. Well, what if you draw into a land? You know, like
That's one
that.
of the things I'm still trying to get. Like, it's like, especially if you're playing any card draw, right?
Uh-huh.
Play the card draw first,
Yeah.
then play your land.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like, it's just these little things that are small. They're little things, but they can really up your game, and they also can just make things a little bit better for you. Like, because this is one thing about Magic that I think all of us have experienced. And for those of you who've been playing for at least any sort of time, you probably know what I'm talking about. When you go through a process, like you have an interaction, or you have a set of things with the cards, a set of events that happens with your cards that you figured out, you played, and you did it right. That feeling of like, oh my God, that was awesome. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's one of the reasons why we love playing this game is it just gives you those little boosts of endorphins. Like, oh, that's nice. That's a nice feeling. I did a smart. And that's part of the reason why I love the game. And when you learn these little things, it helps you get there faster.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of like plenty of those instances I've had, and those are like my more fond memories. Or, you know, that time where you saved that interaction and you were able to actually stop that combo from going off. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Or you
have your Mace of Ith and they're like, hey, I'm attacking. Guess not.
Exactly. Or that time where you successfully read your opponent. You're like, you know, I remember this happened to me in draft, where I'm playing in draft, and I had done a thing where I was like, okay, I have a good creature I can play, and I have a great creature I can play. And first couple times I played the great creature because I thought, oh geez, if I can get that out faster, I can attack with it next turn. It's going to be great. And then it gets removed off the board. The first time I played the good creature instead, and they blast the good creature off the board, and I go, I read it right. Here's the great creature that you just use your removal on. Or you just use your removal and you can't use it on this guy. Yay! And then they had another piece of removal.
That whole bait that you do, and like, you know, throw out your cannon fodder, your red shirts.
Yep,
right?
Exactly.
But like, it reminds me of one of those Reddit comments, and then leave off on this one here. But like, don't go full throttle, and this is one of the things I really need to work on. Where I like I'll play big things because I can. I'll play whatever I can, and I make a board presence. And the problem is that makes me a target.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the biggest target. You want to kind of like subside just a little bit. Don't get too antsy. Because also, if you play everything, you have nothing left to play when they destroy everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a hard lesson learned.
Some things to think about. These are all things, and there's millions more. We barely scratched the surface. We'll probably do another, maybe make this a series. But
we don't know how to play Magic.
Yeah, how we don't know how to play Magic. And these are the things you should learn that we wish we knew before we became old curmudgeons. So that about does it for today. You can find DM Dingo on Twitch or on the FDS Discord. You can find me, FDSMTG, here on YouTube, FDSMTG, as well as on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, FDSMTG, basically everywhere. Also on TikTok as well. Thank you so much for listening, and you all have a wonderful day.